All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Very glad to have you. I see that there's a lot of participants still coming in as we speak, so we'll get started. Good afternoon to you all. I'm Gary Huggins, the Executive Director of the Direct Selling Education Foundation. Welcome to the latest DSEF Insights series, which is part of DSA Engage. We have kind of a unique opportunity today to share something with you. We're very excited to share with you in the spirit of serving our industry, serving each other in these very challenging times. We have a very special guest that we very much appreciate making himself available for this conversation that we're going to have today. We often talk about people who are in the front lines of the COVID battle. Our guest today is very much in those front lines. And a leader in that battle. I want to introduce Dr. John Jefferies, who is the J. Michael Sullivan Distinguished Chair in Cardiology, Professor and Chief Adult Cardiovascular Diseases, and the Professor of Pediatric Cardiology at the University of Tennessee Methodist Hospital System in Memphis. He's also a foremost authority on the COVID vaccine and treatments, and oversees the majority of vaccine trials within the University of Tennessee Health Science Center, which is one of 13 US-funded regional biocontainment laboratories in the country. Dr. Jefferies will talk with us about a number of things today. He'll cover really important topics, including the latest on COVID-19 treatments, certainly vaccine options and how to think about those, some of the myths and concerns that go along with those things, potential side effects of vaccines, what patients can expect when they get them, and sort of update us on the rollout and what that looks like and what he would expect it to look like. Dr. Jefferies has also graciously made himself available for about 10 minutes of questions following his presentation and conversation. So I want to really encourage all of you to use that chat function and get your questions in. We'll do our best to get them in front of Dr. Jefferies so that you can get to what you're most curious about. And with that, let me turn this over to Dr. John Jefferies to take us through his presentation and then talk with us afterwards.
Well, thank you so much, Gary, and thank you all for allowing me to present here today. I really appreciate it. Can everyone see my screen?
Yes. Yes.
Perfect. Very good. Well, so once again, thanks for the opportunity, talking obviously about a very important topic today, and absolutely want this to be bidirectional discussion and look forward to questions. And thank you for the kind introduction. So as you can appreciate, this is today, and this is from the Johns Hopkins website, which I would encourage you, if you really have questions about near real-time data and COVID globally, check out the site. It's quite impressive. But this is a heat map, and you can appreciate that the red dots maybe not necessarily are where you think they might be. And initially in New York, for example, Houston, New Orleans, there were a few places, Chicago, that were hotbeds. But now we're starting to see this sort of seep out into other areas of the country. And some of these numbers are quite impressive. And if you look at down in the bottom right, you can see that the ascension of that curve continues to steepen. And I think we look at Los Angeles, for example, over 1 million cases in LA County. And you can actually individualize this to everywhere in the United States. So wherever you are currently, you can pull this up and get an idea of what the trends are, at least in your own community. And this, I think, is a very telling slide, and you can appreciate the different countries that are represented on this. But United States, unfortunately, is well above other countries when it comes to new case diagnosis. And this is a moving average of 7 days, so we take that into account. We are seeing some declines, which I think is important, obviously, and that's somewhat reassuring. But it's still very, very high. It's over 150,000 cases a day. So that's a real problem when you look at this both nationally and globally. For some reason, my computer has, oh, there we go. Sorry about that. Let me go back. My computer froze there for a second. This is drilling down to the United States specifically. And it's pretty interesting to think that it's almost exactly 1 year since the first case was diagnosed in the US. And unfortunately, you can see these almost stepwise progressions in the number of new cases that we're dealing with. But I think all of us have been obviously in a bit of a fog in this, and our lives have been very disrupted. But to recognize we've been living through this for a year, it was amazing to me when I sort of had that revelation, I guess, that this really has been going on a long time. And we are starting to make progress, obviously, but we're still very much trying to figure out where we are and what to do next. I don't know why my computer keeps freezing. I apologize. And this is just a sheet of telling us about confirmed cases and then deaths. And, you know, unfortunately, the United States is leading the way with by a significant amount. Almost 25 million cases. That's remarkable. And almost 500,000 deaths. And you can appreciate on the far right, we have this idea of deaths per 100,000 in the population. And the United States is up there at 124. You can appreciate a couple of other countries that are surpassing us currently, Italy and the UK. But these are still pretty staggering numbers. So, you know, meaning for every 100,000 people in the population, 124 may succumb to COVID. So I think that that's quite concerning ultimately, and something that we have to pay attention to in the case fatalities. So the road to immunity, what are some things, and Gary addressed this, is that what are the things that maybe would be of interest to you and might be helpful in your decision making? So obviously some of the treatments that we employ currently and that we're evaluating, real focus today will be on vaccine. And what are the myths and concerns associated with vaccines? What are the real life concerns if you are vaccinated? Just a few thoughts on how the rollout was developed and how it's progressed. And then the idea of a road to normalcy. And I think I should have changed that slide and put in parentheses, new normalcy probably, because you know, normalcy as we know it, at least in the healthcare business, it will not be the same. Some of those things are good, and we'll talk about that. There are some things that have come out of this that are quite favorable to people with both acute and chronic medical conditions. But obviously, there are a lot of things that have changed, and there are implications to this virus that potentially have long-term effects. So treatment evolution, as you all have probably heard, there is a therapy that's available called convalescent plasma. And what that means essentially is that someone who has had COVID will inherently develop an immune response. And a part of that response is that they will develop antibodies. Well, those antibodies target, at least in part, the SARS-CoV-2. And we can actually take plasma from patients that have recovered from COVID and give it to patients that are currently COVID positive in a hope of trying to mitigate some of the severity of the illness. And one thing you need to remember about a lot of these therapies, whether it's antibodies, whether it's remdesivir, whether it's steroids, whatever the case may be, we're not trying to clear the virus. We don't have anything that's going to take the virus out of your body currently, okay? What we're trying to do is ameliorate the symptoms and keep you from being maybe asymptomatic to mildly symptomatic to progressing to near death or requiring mechanical ventilation or being in the hospital. So none of these are panaceas or magic bullets, right? They all have their own nuances, But that being said, the vaccines really are maybe that opportunity to try and avoid the virus actually causing cellular damage. And we'll show some pictures of that in just a minute. But above all, what we're trying to do is support these patients and get them through. So remember, a virus, you have viruses in your system now, and you've been exposed to viruses this week, period. But do those viruses cause disease? Not always, no, right? And you harbor viruses. I don't think people always remember that, once you have a virus, you can actually retain that virus in your system. An example of that is chickenpox, right? So you get chickenpox as a child. Well, can that manifest again later on in life? And the answer is yes, it can. And it's called shingles. And that is a virus that you had an acute problem, then it became dormant, then it was reactivated in the form of shingles. So remember that these viruses, some of them hang around, quote unquote. And so, and that always offers the opportunities like, well, I dealt with it the first time, but is there the potential for this to be reactivated in the future and cause further damage? And I think the answer is yes. So those are things that we have to be cognizant of. So these are just some basic slides on virology and then on vaccine development, if you will. And so as you can appreciate in the cartoon, hopefully you can see my pointer, but this is actually the SARS-CoV-2 sort of cartoon representation. So you basically see a donut, if you will, so a capsid, something that holds information. And inside of this is RNA. And so everyone's heard of DNA, right? And your DNA. So what happens in biology is that your DNA ultimately is used to spell out another string of information called RNA, which is what's here. And that RNA is what gets translated into proteins. And everything in your body consists of proteins. So that's important. But this is not DNA, this is RNA. So kind of the middle step, if you will, from where your genetic material is to where you get what we would call your phenotype, how tall you are, your hair color, all that kind of stuff, okay? And so, but the interesting thing about this virus are these little spikes. And so for those folks that maybe took some Latin, you remember back to corona. Corona means crown, right? So you see these little spikes that sort of look like a crown. And these little spikes are basically how the virus facilitates entry into the cells. So you have the virus floating around, and then via this receptor that pretty much every cell in your body has, it's called an Ace2 receptor, this receptor actually is like a lock and key with that spike, that little corona crown thing. And what happens is that once that connection is made, the cell actually views that as something it wants to take in. So it essentially invaginates or engulfs the virus and brings it inside of the cell. And then in ACE2s, you may have heard of, any of you that have blood pressure issues or heart issues, you may be on an ACE inhibitor. Similar, that's the same kind of, it's called angiotensin converting enzyme. Similar thing here. So there were a lot of concerns if you saw the press about people taking angiotensin receptor blockers, angiotensin converting enzyme inhibitors, if that increased mortality in this group, and it turns out that it doesn't. So, so then the virus comes into the cell and it essentially gets popped open, if you will. And when that happens, that bit of alphabet soup, your RNA, is exposed. And then that's when we that's when we start replicating the virus, basically. So that's when the RNA gets translated into proteins. So you go from this virus to multiple viruses, okay? And then on the next slide, you'll see then all of those viruses are then released out into your system, right? So now you have replicated virus and it's going out wherever, everywhere, potentially, maybe doing the same thing in other cells, right? But what's important is that in a normal host, I mean, you're not immunocompromised, you don't have some sort of congenital bone marrow anomaly or something, your body's gonna recognize this thing as an antigen, and that's something that's foreign essentially to the body. So just like if I do a heart transplant on someone, or one of you gets a hip replacement, or whatever the case may be, it's a foreign body, okay? And your body's very smart. It recognizes what's normal and what's not normal. And that's going to say, I don't think you're supposed to be here. Let's generate a response because we want to get you out of here, okay? And that happens in two ways. So you have what are called T helper cells, and they kind of recognize this as a bad thing, and they start calling their buddies, which are cytotoxic T cells, and then B cells. Well, B cells are where all of your antibodies come from. Okay, so your B cells are triggered to generate antibodies that are specific to bind to this antigen and try and get rid of it. That's what you're trying to do. Okay, and if you go and your question to your physician is, have I had COVID? They're going to do a test called an antibody test. Okay, and that's based on what you're seeing now. You can see why. They are looking to see if you've been exposed to the antigen and generated antibodies, right? And there are going to be two types of antibodies. There's one called an IgM, which is acute. So that would mean you probably either have active infection or you were infected within the last week or two, or they're called IgG antibodies. And those are the ones that hang out forever. So if you get re-exposed, your system's going to get revved up again and say, hey, I remember this is a bad thing. I'm going to go try and get rid of it. Okay. And then you also maintain these T cells, and they actually can destroy multiple things: bacteria, fungi, viruses, all that kind of stuff. So that's where this memory response comes when we talk about vaccination. Okay. So in the US, there are two currently FDA approved vaccines. And both are of the first bullet there, which are mRNA vaccines. So we just talked about the RNA. The M just stands for messenger, and it's sort of an abbreviated form. And then the other ones are vector vaccines, which we'll talk a little bit about. Nothing FDA approved currently in that category, but there's a lot of clinical investigation. And then protein subunit vaccines, also nothing FDA approved. But there is active investigation. So the two FDA approved vaccines, which I'm sure you've all heard about or read about or maybe even received, are from Pfizer, which is approved for patients 16 and over, okay? And then Mrna has a virus for 18 and older. And the age cutoffs are purely just how the studies were designed. It's not because they're unique to one age group or another. Both of these require 2 shots. For the Pfizer, they're 21 days apart, and you try and meet that window as tightly as you can. So be as exact to 21 days. But there are data out there that you can wait till later and still receive the second dose. And then Mrna is 28 days, almost a month between shots. Important thing about this, and this always comes up if we're given vaccines in general, whether it's flu or an MMR or anything, is the concern about patients being allergic to eggs, to preservatives, which is a huge category, right? Or latex. And it turns out that neither of these vaccines have any of these as a part of their substrate. So no matter if you have these allergies, you can still get the vaccine. So let's talk a little bit about those viruses, the vaccines that are currently approved. And so, as I said, we're talking about RNA, so that's Mrna and the Pfizer. And then we have DNA viruses. And so RNA, as I said, is kind of that middle step between your DNA, your chromosomal material, and the manufacturing of proteins. Okay, and this is true of biology for every gene, every protein. Okay, and so what we're doing is we're going to take sort of a modified form of the RNA that the virus holds. So meaning it's not going to be clinically or physically active, physiologically active. So it's not a bioactive. It's not like I am giving you the live virus and the DNA or the RNA contents of that virus. But what it does is it triggers that response that you saw earlier, right? So it comes in, gets engulfed, and we start looking at it, and we start seeing these fragments or pieces of the RNA that we're going to target for our immune response. And so that's how these that's how these vaccines are working. And once this gets in and starts being analyzed, it actually is degraded. So there's no residual of the mRNA that you're going to find after the vaccine. It's there to prompt the immunologic response. Similarly, you can do DNA, and DNA is a little different. So let's say I wanted to only give some DNA material for those little crown spikes thing, but nothing else for the virus. And we gave that, and then it gets evaluated. Ultimately, as we said, DNA goes to RNA. Well, then it goes to RNA, and then the process occurs. But through this, you're going to generate those B cells, which give you the immunoglobulins or antibodies, and the T cells, which are going to give you the long-term sort of natural killer T cell opportunities for memory. Okay. So what are the other ones that we mentioned? So remember, none of these you can get in the United States currently unless you are going to potentially be under a research umbrella in some way. So one is the idea of, and some of you have probably heard about this, but we do use weakened viruses sometimes, right? So meaning something that actually may cause a few symptoms and whatnot, but it's not going to cause full-blown disease. And obviously that's going to be seen as a foreign substance to the body, and that immunologic reaction is going to occur. The other opportunity is to use a virus that we know won't replicate. So almost like a Trojan horse, if you will, that where you have this body or capsid or globe that's going to get everything inside of the body and inside of the cell, but it's not going to make a bunch of different copies. It's only going to essentially deliver that little bit of the gene or of the RNA that we want to look at specifically and target, like the spike gene that we've been talking about. You can just give some of the components, right? So some of the subunits, if you will. So you can see maybe if I just gave those little spikes, that would create an immunologic response. And that's true, it would. And then lastly is, what about if, in sort of a modified version of that is, what if I took the globe or the little capsid that the virus is, get rid of the RNA on the inside, so it can't replicate, but I still have all of those little markers on the outside that I can sort of target for my immunologic response, okay? And that's a virus-like particle. So like I say, this is purely for edification. You cannot access this. You cannot call your doctor and get it. These are things that will probably be in the future, okay? So just some common questions are, who should get vaccinated or who should not get vaccinated? And it's pretty straightforward, is that anyone who's received a dose of the vaccine, either company, and you develop an anaphylactic reaction to that, you should not receive the second dose until you've been evaluated by an allergist, immunologist, and that sort of thing. Because that could be, anaphylaxis is when like people have peanut allergies and you see them carrying EpiPens. That's anaphylaxis, where their oral pharynx becomes swollen, they can't breathe, their blood pressure oftentimes will be disturbed, their heart rate goes up, and it's a potentially lethal situation. Well, if I knew that happened the first time, I sure wouldn't want it to potentially happen again, right? So we wouldn't give it a second dose. And some of the components of these vaccines can be something that promotes an immunogenic response or an allergic response. And there are things like polyethylene glycol that you can see in a myriad of compounds. And if you have an allergy to that, though, that does not mean that you can't get the vaccine, okay? It means that you need to be seen by an allergy immunology doc and see what the right answer is. Meaning perhaps you can be desensitized. So you've heard about allergy shots, for example, or maybe you should be pre-medicated to avoid an allergic reaction. So steroids and histamine blockers like Benadryl and that sort of thing. That may be an opportunity to pre-medicate you, give you the vaccine and avoid that allergic reaction. and I think this is very important just because, if you look at it in a very critical way, there are very few people who should not get vaccinated. Obviously, we don't have the answer for that 16 and under group. That's a different discussion. But everyone else, you really need a pretty strong reason as to why you wouldn't, if that's actually the case. So hopefully that helps. So some common myths and concerns, and I think these are fascinating. And these are some of our own clinical experience, but you'll see on the internet, this is true of every major medical center in the United States, that these questions are recurring. First is the vaccine is not safe because it was rapidly developed. And that fortunately is false. It's true that it was developed rapidly. And I can tell you, up until COVID, the process for drug and device development in medicine was glacially slow. There are a lot of therapies out there that it takes so much time to accrue safety data or efficacy data. And people are very stringent, as they should be. This is someone's health. But oftentimes there are people suffering from terminal diseases that don't have access to therapies because this process has been so delayed. This one was accelerated. And this is one of those good points that I was telling you has come out of this, is that I think that this has changed the way we think about drug approval, at least in the US, that it can be done quicker. And if you consolidate resources and companies, you can get a lot of data very quickly. And so for this one, over 50,000 people we have safety data. So that's pretty good. That's more than any single clinical trial in cardiovascular medicine that's ever occurred. So that's a pretty robust number. And it really is because people came together, I think, and worked in a relatively cohesive manner with a dedicated destination. So I do think this is a common question, and I get it. And I have to admit, even I thought this when I first heard about the vaccines, like, I just don't think there's enough data. But, the way we accrue those data sets is by administering the vaccine. And I felt like I should be one of those frontline people trying it and making sure things are okay. Another one is that recovery from a prior infection, let's say you had COVID, well, you don't need a vaccine anymore. And that's not true either. Remember that when you have COVID, like I said, you're going to generate some antibodies on your own. The problem is I have no idea how long they're going to last. And this is true of other diseases, right? So many of you may have received a booster shot for tetanus, for example. All that means is that your immune response was starting to fade. Okay, so maybe you didn't have a lot of that antibody left, for example, and you needed to be re-exposed to the antigen or the bad thing to create more antibody and up your levels again. And that's what we're talking about here, is that I don't know how long. You may have a good antibody response, you may have a poor antibody response. Either way, I don't know how long they're going to hang out. So the point is, it's great that you had a potential antibody exposure. That's going to be helpful, there's no doubt. But is it going to be enough to get you through another exposure? And the answer is we don't know. So I think having the vaccine is absolutely indicated. People have been vaccinated, they don't need to wear a mask. And this is an interesting one. Well, why do I care? If I get COVID, I'm cool, I have a vaccine. Well, it's a problem because you have that immunologic sort of response, you may be asymptomatic. So based on what you saw in the earlier cartoons, if the antibody binds to the virus, it's not going to get into the cells, okay? But the virus is still in your body. So, and this happens all the time. Like, if you have kids, for example, you're going to get exposed to viruses that they bring home from daycare. Some of them you'll actually become symptomatic. Some of them you don't actually become symptomatic, but you're harboring the virus. And what we're saying here is you have the vaccine and you actually get exposed again, and you have an active viral exposure in your lungs and in your mouth and your nose. Well, you're going to be okay, But if you don't wear a mask, you're potentially transmitting it to everyone else. Does that make sense? So it's not so much a worry about you. You need to worry about the people around you. And that's an important one, I think. And then this idea that the vaccine will alter my personal DNA. Now that you have that understanding of genetics, transcription, translation, we just said that it goes DNA, RNA, and then protein, right? So the RNA is not going to go backwards and incorporate into your DNA. That's not the way that this works. So there is no change in your chromosomal material because of receiving an RNA vaccine. So hopefully everyone knows that, but do not feel that, because you get the vaccine, you're going to grow an extra toe. That's not the way that this works. So it's okay from that perspective. And then these are some other ones. There's a concern that pregnant women can't receive the vaccine. They can, unless there's some obvious reason that they shouldn't. There have been, and we actually are part of an ongoing trial to specifically target pregnant women with a vaccine to see, maybe the dosing requirements are different, for example. So those are things that we're going to try and figure out. People that are immunocompromised cannot be vaccinated. So maybe someone who's had a bone marrow transplant or kidney transplant, or have, severe combined immunodeficiencies or whatever. Actually, those people arguably maybe should be a higher target because they're not going to fight off the virus as well. So they actually can receive the vaccine and probably should. Vaccines cause infertility. Not true, no data. There was also some concerns that these caused some spontaneous abortions, so none of that has been ferreted out to be true. So very important that long-term, if you're worried, well, this is going to impact my ability to have a family, we don't see evidence of that. And then lastly is, well, if I get this, I'm gonna get COVID. And I hear this from patients all the time that get flu shots. Doc, I didn't get a flu shot for 23 years. You told me to get one and I had the flu. And it's like, well, that's not the way it works. And we're trying to, with flu, for example, we're not trying to prevent you from getting the flu. We're trying to prevent you from becoming symptomatic in the duration of the flu, right? Where that doesn't necessarily happen, that you're not going to get exposed and get infected. Similarly here, this is an RNA virus, but we're giving a portion of the RNA, so it's not biologically active. So you're not going to have COVID because you got a COVID vaccine. Now, will you potentially have some effects of the vaccine? Absolutely, but it's not because you have a documented COVID case. And these are just a bit of a comparison of the different sorts of opportunities. The two RNAs we talked about. This AstraZeneca is a viral, which you heard a little bit about, and that's currently under investigation. And then Sputnik is also a viral vector being evaluated in Russia, which is also a viral vector, but neither one of those is commercially available in the US. So as I said, if you get the vaccine, are you potentially never going to know anything happen? Yeah, maybe some people don't have any effects, if you will, from the exposure to the vaccine. But this is an injection, right? You do it in the deltoids, so upper arm, and you get a shot. So anytime you get a shot, could you have pain, swelling, and redness? Of course you can. But remember, we're trying to mimic that response that you would have to a true COVID infection. Well, what would happen if you had a true viral infection? Well, you may get chills. You may feel a little tired, you may have a headache, right? Things that would be flu-like in some ways. But these are very short-lived. So I had my 2 doses completed a few, I guess, maybe a week or two ago. And I was maybe a little fatigued, and my arm hurt a little bit, but it lasted less than a day. So just something to keep in mind. And if you do get a vaccine, this is a way that you can improve the knowledge of these vaccines. This is from the CDC, and you can actually go in and have a sort of an interactive dialogue with them and tell them what you think's going on. Doc, I got the vaccine and now I can't see out of my left eye very well or something. you can report that sort of stuff, and that way we can track this over time, which I think is important. In the last, I have about 3 minutes here, so I'll be fast. When we talk about the rollout, we've really, you try and approach it in a relatively agnostic way. When we talk about new therapeutics, what's the science? How are we going to implement it? And is it ethical, right? And you've seen some of the science, and we do think that there's probably a balance of harm and good, and risks and benefits. How do you implement it? So can you really scale it, and is it feasible? And then are we really doing the right thing? Are we making sure we're being fair to multiple populations? And are we being completely honest with what we know about the therapy? So this is how things were rolled out. And as you all know, I mean, healthcare personnel had access, as well as long-term care facilities like nursing homes. And then, then we were talking about that next potential line of exposures and essential workers. And then now to this age 65, and some, for our trials, for example, we're actually dropping it to age over 50, considering to be potentially high risk. And then those associated medical conditions, right? So if you've had a heart attack, if you have diabetes, if you have high blood pressure, if you're obese, all those things, how does that weigh in? Because inherently, you're not going to tolerate an infection as well as someone who does not have those sorts of comorbidities. And I think this, just to try and be relatively, fair about it, I think all in all, for the folks that have been had the opportunity, like healthcare personnel and nursing home patients, I think things have gone reasonably well. I think the science is supportive of what we're doing. I do think the implementation has been okay. I think it could have been better, but it's been okay. And a lot of that, sometimes is at the state level or even at the local level. But I do think ethically, people have been pretty transparent about what to expect and what it's been doing. Road to normalcy, like I said, I don't think there is a road to normalcy if that's, 2018, if that's what normalcy is. I don't think that that's going to occur. I think we have a new normal that we're driving towards. And these are the concerns that I just came up with. This isn't from Fauci or anything, but I'm sure at least some of these he would agree with. Is that, do we have enough availability? Because, ultimately the goal is going to be to have a vaccine opportunity for every human being on the planet. Well, that's a pretty big lift. And how do you get it to them, right? So in remote areas of the world, are those patients going to have access to these vaccines? Funding, and I do think that that's been a major target of industry, which is good. But as you know, in drug development, for example, without money, it goes nowhere. And so that's an important thing. This idea of the pediatrics, as I said, 16 and younger is still a group that we don't have an FDA-approved vaccine for, but there are studies ongoing to evaluate what is the appropriate dosing, for example, for a pediatric patient. And remember, that's a little more complicated. What I want to vaccine, I want to vaccinate a 1-year-old compared to a 15-and-a-half-year-old, different body mass, different maturation, all that kind of stuff. So it's a complex question. The comorbidities we talked about a little bit, but I want to just make everyone cognizant that, just because you have an infection and you get through it, okay, let's say that, you had the sniffles, few chills, you quarantined, you're fine now, you've retested, you're not positive, all that sort of thing. Well, like I said, one, the virus can hang out, quote unquote, be dormant, right? But the other thing is that there are data coming out, for at least for in my world, that maybe 75 to 80% of people that have COVID have some sort of heart involvement. So 8 in 10, that's a lot. So if you think about that from my perspective, that means all the 20, 30, 40-year-olds that didn't need to see a cardiologist, 80% of them might. So that's a big impact on the health system, right? That's a lot of people. So just something to keep in mind, that it's not just about the acute phase. I hope everyone takes that away. And then this idea of resistance, and this is probably the biggest concern. And if you watch the news or Wall Street Journal or anything, or New York Times, you see this stuff, is that, what if the target, what if the thing that we're trying to develop an antibody to, like you've seen, what if it changes? So now what I was developing my response to, it morphed into something else. And that's what we're talking about with a mutation. And so this is from Nature, which is one of the most prestigious journals in the entire world. And they have running updates about findings in medicine or clinical stuff related to COVID. And you can see that there's real concern that maybe these vaccines will lose potency. And that's because the target moved, it changed, okay? So I was trying to make my lock and key for this particular thing, and now it's something a little bit different. So the key doesn't fit perfectly anymore. Or maybe there's no hole at all for the key. Maybe it's completely changed into something different. So getting everyone vaccinated, hugely important. But my point is that going to confer immunity to everyone that receives the vaccine? And the point is maybe not, because now there's a new variant they're being exposed to and their antibodies don't attack it as vigorously, right? And so you have seen people get reinfected. And unfortunately, those people that get reinfected typically have a pretty bad outcome. And when you put an antigen into your body, your body's very smart, but it's not going to develop antibodies that are ultra specific just to the virus. It's going to develop other things as well. And some of those antibodies may be targeted to your tissues. So that's called autoimmune disease, right? So lupus, rheumatoid arthritis, all these things. Those are diseases because your immune system is attacking you, essentially. Well, that can happen here. And we've seen that, in heart tissue, lung tissue, that's sort of the innocent bystander can also be damaged, not because of COVID, but because of your reaction to COVID as a body. This is just, so what I'm telling you, I guess, ultimately is there's a lot of unmet potential and need, right? That we can't just say, let's just, give Pfizer, Mrna $100 trillion and develop a bunch of vaccines. It's not that simple. These are some of the ongoing clinical investigations. You can see in our state, in Tennessee, we're about 15 studies, and we drive a lot of those, remember a lot of those here in Memphis. And there are a variety of different types that I can talk to you about. But this is kind of where things are going. And for those familiar with drug approval, phase ones are typically safety. So we need to make sure we're not going to hurt anybody, and typically a generally healthy population. Phase two is like a little bit of safety, and then we want to know some efficacy. So in a small group, does it do what it's supposed to do? And then phase three are these large trials that you hear about where they're randomized and they're big numbers and they're very expensive. And you can see there's a lot of stuff going on. We do the antibody studies and the vaccine studies. So antibody studies are really about, what if I could create a bunch of antibodies that specifically only target COVID and give them to you intravenously or subcutaneously? And those are some trials that are actively ongoing now through Regeneron and some other companies. So there's a lot of opportunity here. We just need to keep looking. So to conclude, I do think we're making progress. I think importantly, collaboration is increasing, and prior warring factions or competitors are now learning how to work together. I do think we're making better use of resource, because you have to. Time is of the essence. Now, you can't just drag your feet, but I am still concerned. Scale is an issue. And probably most importantly, as you heard, it was, what if what I'm shooting at moves before the bullet gets there? And that's, I think, one of the things that we have to be cognizant of moving forward. So as Gary was saying, you all will have access to these slides. This is my contact information. Please feel free to reach out if there's anything I can answer. If you want to know more about the science and all of the true sort of clinical data behind all this information, I'd be happy to talk with you. Or if I can help you or your companies, I'd be happy to do that as well. So with that, thank you.
All right. Well, Dr. Jefferies, that was fantastic information. Thank you so much. for sharing that, and thank you for being so generous with your contact information and offer a follow-up. We really appreciate that, all of us. And a few questions that we'd like to throw out there, and I would encourage folks to continue to use the Q&A function as we go through this remaining 10 minutes or so that we have together with questions. But on the vaccine, I'm really curious, maybe a couple of related issues when you talk about that moving target. When we think about other strains of the virus that are out there currently that we know of, whether that's in the UK or other places where those different sorts of strains, South Africa, I think, in Brazil, have shown themselves, are the vaccinations we currently have effective on those? And then what is your level of confidence this evolution in vaccinations that you've talked about that's being looked at in the study phase at this point, it moves toward those mutations and moving targets?
And those are great questions. I think, so remember the cartoons that I showed you, we have the spikes, we have the envelope, and we have the RNA, right? So if you think about it, it depends on which part of those mutate. So if my vaccine is targeting the mRNA, but the mutation is in a spike protein, the vaccine still may work, right? Because that mutation didn't affect my target, quote unquote. But if those are common, then they may not work as well. And it's not an all or nothing, it's a continuum. You may get a partial response, you may get no response. So, and part of that's going to depend on the patient, and I think that the mutation or the path that, that change that you're talking about. I do think that the world is becoming cognizant of this, and this is not novel to corona. RNA viruses are known to mutate. And you get changes in viruses all the time. When you get your flu shot, we talk about the strains, right? Well, those change every year. It's not the same flu shot every year. So those are things that we have to pay attention to. So I do think science is paying attention to that. What I hope is that even with these vaccines, we get some sort of a partial response where people can live through it, right? Do okay, but then also mount a response to that new mutated variant or that variant that is different. So you have COVID-1, COVID-2, if you will, and that your body is going to be able to get you through it, but it's also going to say, this is another new foreign body that I'm going to remember, quote unquote, and I'm going to take care of that. I think the only way to even get at that, though, is the universal vaccinations ultimately. And I do think there'll be other vaccines that come out, and there's nothing that says you can't use vaccines in tandem. So you saw some of those proteins, right? So the partial protein, and then maybe towards mRNA. Well, if you think one of those is going to change, right, or be a variant, but the other is going to be the same, but you don't really know which one, maybe you give both. So I think those are possibilities that could exist in the future, right? That's very far thinking. Please don't call Dr. Fauci telling us that we should give 2 vaccines to everyone. But that being said, that really could be what happens.
Yeah, that's interesting. We're getting variations on this question, which I think at some level is unanswerable from what you've shared with us, but maybe I would amend it to say, when might we begin to understand these answers? And that is, including from people who've had the vaccine, I'm seeing in the questions. When are we likely to know how long this immunity lasts with the current vaccines and as they?
Yeah, it's a super question. So, for the ongoing vaccine development, for example, if you're in a clinical trial, we're going to follow you. So part of that's going to be symptoms, part of that's going to be swabbing you to see if you still have virus and all that sort of business, or if you've accrued virus. But part of it's going to be measuring your blood levels for those immunoglobulins or those antibodies. If you think about it as a population, a lot of it's going to probably be a Gaussian distribution. There's some people are going to have immunity for a long period of time, and some people for a very short period of time, and a lot of people within 2 standard deviations, right, or 2 confidence intervals. So I think that's information that we just have to wait and see. And it's not, unfortunately, biology and medicine, it just isn't always yes, no. So let's say that you maintain the antibodies, but are they going to be as efficacious, right? Are they going to work as well? Don't know. So those are the things that we kind of have to wait and see. And it's not just the antibodies, also those T cells that we talked about too. And all these drugs that are approved typically have a post-marketing method to collect data. So, there are opportunities to look at this even in the general population outside of a clinical trial, to see what the response is. But, everyone's a little bit different. Your immune reactions sometimes are more robust as a child. So we give vaccines early, right? And as you get older, sometimes that wanes. So it may not just be, male, female kind of thing. It could also be 85 versus 45. How long do you maintain those antibodies? Because you may not have created as much, your response may not have been as robust because you're a little bit older. So all those things have to be considered, and it's tough. It really is a bit of a lot of it's unknown. But I do think everyone, please remember, the SARS-2 is a variant of viruses that we've seen in the past, right? So there are existing data to help us kind of understand. It's just the mortality and the spread of this has just been so unpredictable, I think, has made it hard.
Wow. Something that stood out to me, and I would imagine others as well. We've got a 14 and a 16-year-old still in the house. I'm just looking at that sort of cutoff time of available vaccines. Does that say to us we just don't know, but we shouldn't necessarily be concerned about getting it for younger children? Or where
Oh,
does that evolve into?
no. So I have an 11 and 9-year-old, so I agree with you completely.
Yeah.
The only reason those cutoffs are developed is that's what the FDA approved. And the FDA approved it based on the clinical trial data, basically. So Pfizer designed a trial and they said, we're only going to enroll patients 16 and older. So it doesn't mean you can't give it to a 12-year-old. It just means we don't have the data for FDA approval, right? So what I'm saying is there are ongoing investigations for kids. You have to. I mean, think about classes, and we just talked about viruses. I mean, anyone who has kids knows you get everything from your kids because they bring it home, right? Well, what if they're transmitting COVID to everyone? That's horrible. We can't do that. So it's absolutely an absolute paramount of importance to develop some sort of an immunization for kids. But these data don't mean we're just going to leave kids off because we're not worried about them or they don't need it or whatever. It purely just means that in these initial studies, the studies were designed for adults, basically. And if you think about it, it kind of makes sense. We do that for every drug pretty much, because I would hate to do a trial in a 5-year-old and do harm, right? I really want to know, is it safe, quote unquote? And typically we study adult populations to do that first. Kids are dynamic, they're growing, there are all these other sorts of milieu to consider. So this is true of any blood pressure medicine that we get approval for kids or whatever the case may be. You always study in adults typically, and then we use that information to inform a trial for kids, because the dosing can be different and all these other sorts of things.
Yeah, that's really helpful to know. And maybe shifting a little bit, we've got a question in about whether there's been any research to understand why the U.S. continues to struggle with control of the virus compared to other countries. Is it a matter of we're testing more and we know more, or what's the difference?
I'm sure there are data out there. I have to admit that's a little bit more out of the medical spectrum in some ways, because some of that is behavior, right? And it's not just pure biology. It's, lack of mass. It's cohorting with people that, not social distancing. So you guys hear that all the time on the news and everything else. I'm sure there are robust reports about all of this. I think, just as a generality, I think, every state, and if you go to that Hopkins site, for example, it's amazing. You can drill down to your state and it'll show you specifically time points of when things were closed, when they were opened. And you can look visually to see if you think things increase, decrease, increase, decrease. I'm not saying that's the only answer, but I do think it has something to do with it. And I don't know, I guess in some ways, and I even see this from some of my patients who are highly educated, is that they don't really believe that this is a serious disease, and which I find unusual. And I just say, listen, come with me and we'll go to the emergency room where they're boarding 50 patients and I will take you to the ICU. And this is not some contrived idea. This is real. And so, and it's not only that. Remember, let's say I am 82, I'm at home, I'm having a little bit of chest pain, but I heard the ER's backed up for 8 days and there's a lot of COVID over there. I don't want to go over there and contract COVID. Okay. Well, that person was having a heart attack.
Wow.
So they could die because they didn't go to the emergency room because they were underinformed, right? Or they're going to have heart disease long term, and they're ultimately going to have that heart attack, maybe develop heart failure and have to go to the ER anyway. Well, now they're in a much worse spot they were when they started having chest pain. So I think a lot of it is, with most things in life, is education and just saying, listen, we want to help you. We want to take care of you, but you can't ignore common things. You may be having a stroke, maybe having a heart attack, maybe having a pulmonary embolism. Well, I don't want to go to the ER because I'm worried about, well, these other things kill a lot of people. So you can't do that just because you're worried about COVID.
Right. Well, let me ask the question that has come up specifically, and I know is on certainly everyone's mind in our industry, as we are accustomed to getting together and having big meetings and conferences and doing face-to-face business and presentations and those things. When do you see, or it may be unfair to ask, when ought we to think about things returning to us being able to get together to have conferences, et cetera?
Yeah, it's a great question. I wish I had an answer. It's like I said before, if I knew the answer, I'd probably be investing heavily in certain stocks. But I just don't know. I think until we have an opportunity for global immunization, it's going to be a hard thing to do. I think you could probably look at the number of employees that you have and get an idea of when you're going to have access to those vaccines in your community, and probably give yourself a pretty good guesstimate of when everyone will be immunized, right? So maybe it's 4 months, 6 months, 9 months, depends on where you are, the city, the state, all that sort of business. I got it. But okay, great. Well, what about though these variations, right? These mutations that we're talking about. So now you have another pathogen out there. Right now, no one knows what kind of impact that's going to have. But as we were hearing just before we came onto this meeting, the virulence and the aggressiveness of these variants or new strains is more significant than the COVID that we are dealing with now. So think about that, is that you bring all your employees back and, in the lunchroom together, everyone's vaccinated, but now someone's harboring one of those new variants, this new spin on COVID. They're exposing everyone. Well, that's exactly what you were dealing with when you started, right? So I don't think anyone can tell you for sure. I do think there is, like we talked about, the partial response and some immunity. So could you get through that? I do think that's possible. The thing that worries me equally, I guess, as much as those downstream effects that we talked about. So like I said, maybe 80% of people have cardiac involvement. Well, they live through COVID, but now they develop heart failure, or they have a premature heart attack, right? Well, that still affects your company. They're not going to be working. So I think it's way more complicated than just saying, hey, I got all my employees vaccinated, we're good to go. I hope that's the case, but please understand there are a lot of nuances to this, that it's just not that straightforward.
On that point, Doctor, that's fascinating, something you said earlier about it's not just about the acute phase of COVID.
That's right.
But at 30, 40, 50-year-old, what should they do different if they've been through, had COVID at whatever level?
Yeah, it's a great question. Unfortunately, we don't really have guidelines for that right now. And it's something I've been talking to our federal legislators to start thinking about is, you lived through it, but now how do I watch you over time, right? How do I make sure that you're okay from COVID? And I don't think any of us really know. I think those people that really did have obvious involvement. So for example, as you may have read, a lot of people get blood clots with COVID. So that's a big concern. People come in and develop blood clots, their veins, their arteries, their coronaries, everything. And a lot of them are treated with aggressive blood thinning medicines during that time, right? Well, long term, let's say they get through that, they get rid of that clot. And at some point they're going to say, well, I want to stop this anticoagulation medicine, the blood thinner, right? Well, is that safe? I don't know. I don't know. Are you going to have a hypercoagulable, like a blood clotting problem moving forward because of this exposure? I don't know. Maybe. So does that mean we should at least periodically watch you and make sure you don't have markers of blood clots or a propensity to blood clots? Probably. Yeah. If that's a very defined population, the majority of people just have some sniffles, myalgias, and maybe a little tired, and they move on. Well, the problem is a lot of these things are subclinical. So could you have done some damage to your heart that you didn't feel? You could have. Could you have damaged your kidneys and it's not affecting your urination? Absolutely. So we're going to have to reset also, I think, just how we look at patients just from a general checkup perspective if they've had COVID. But those are huge discussions, and you can imagine the economic impacts that has. Huge. I mean, almost, I can't even begin to think about what that means. Right. But there will need to be some guidelines, because people are just going to do it willy-nilly. That's not going to get us anywhere. It has to be uniform.
Yeah. Well, that's interesting. And doctor, let me ask you one more question, and if I could impose on you to give a very short answer to it, because I want to make sure we recognize our friend Greg Harris from the University of Tennessee to say a couple things to us as well. That'd be very valuable. But this idea that the hopeful idea that the process we've gone through to develop these vaccinations resulting in changing the way we bring forth treatments, vaccinations, and the like, are you optimistic that that will actually change, or do you think it's going to take this sort of thing to make us behave that way?
I'm pretty optimistic. I think it gives us leverage. In the past, I do a lot of work in drug development space, for example, and to get things approved is hard, as it should be. The point is that it doesn't have to be as time protracted, right? That things can be condensed. And in my world, delaying a treatment kills people. If I'm waiting 10 years for an FDA approval, people are dying because of that if it actually works. Yeah. And I think now as providers, we have leverage to say, listen, in the past you said you couldn't do it. Now we know that you can, right?
Yeah, wow. Well, doctor, we can't thank you enough for this great conversation, and really look forward to sharing this beyond the folks that have been with us today with our DSA membership, and encourage our members to share this with their extended families and their sales force, respectively. But the University of Tennessee provides business guidance on COVID and similar health-related topics through their own corporate exchange program. And Greg Harris, who has a significant role in that at the UT Foundation, is the Senior Director of Development, joined us to just say a few words about the work you guys are doing and what we can learn from that.
Gary, thank you very much, and appreciate Dr. Jefferies' time today. Yeah, this is coordination of this presentation was through my office, which also manages a program called Corporate Exchange. The Corporate Exchange is a simple, no fee, no cost membership group of companies that have an interest in receiving current health information. And so we provide information that what we're doing with the UT Health Science Center on academic study, clinical services, research advancements, and in turn, with familiarity, we provide some programming for our members. In 2020, we did a couple of COVID programs, one right out of the chute in beginning of April, and then a couple of others throughout the year, as well as addressed physical and mental health concerns. This year, our members have asked us to do some programs relating to telehealth, work and family home management, which seems to be a constant struggle for everybody, as well as corporate wellness programs and how to revise those and make those relevant today. So we're going to address all those through the year. Plus, we provide for each company, their management team, to have some personal health advice. So if they have some issues, for example, a CEO called me this week and his mother fell and needed potentially hip surgery, but because of her age, it was life-threatening and wanted some advice. I also had another company that had a public-facing business and had stores, and the COVID ran through and they had to close several of them. And he was trying to figure out, when do I open? How do I open? And, you know, what's the effects? So we were able to provide that information on a personal basis, confidential personal basis. So I just want to say, if anybody has interest in hearing more programs like this, again, it's free. I think your website has our website listed for a little bit of time, and they can call me direct. Also, my phone number is 404-358-5283. And I think somebody on your team probably has that also to pass along if there's any interest. But we appreciate the opportunity to present the information today.
Well, Greg, thank you so much for all of that. And we'll make sure, as we share this and make this available, that your contact information is available and part of that. And also, I would encourage everybody, if you look in chat right now, that link has been provided that Greg's talking about. So I would encourage all of you to connect with these guys if they can be of service to you. Greg and Dr. Jefferies, wow, thank you so much. This is great information. As most of you know, the foundation partners with academics all over the country to bring expertise and value and research in support of the direct selling channel. And I'm really proud of our team in doing that work. I want to thank especially Kimberly Harris Blyton, who's our Senior Director of Academic Initiatives, for making this session happen, which was a fantastic conversation with great information. And we look forward for sharing that out. Also, if you look at the screen now, slide talks about more of that expertise in part of the DSEF Insight series. You see the opportunity to sign up for our first two customer focused webinars, customer acquisition, journey mapping, and there'll be a third to come over the next couple of months. We encourage you to participate in those. You'll be hearing more information from us on that. Certainly from our colleagues at DSA in Engage with the great information that's been provided through that series. We'll continue and look forward to information there. And again, thank all of you for being a part of this, and really hope that you're able to take advantage of the great information that Dr. Jefferies and Greg have brought to us. And we hope we can continue the conversation with these gentlemen as well. So have a great Friday and a great weekend. Thank you so much.